I'm Marissa Cole, 29, holding my baby under a highway overpass while the wind lifted paper cups and loose gravel like they weighed nothing, wondering how a warm crib had turned into cold concrete in a single season. I can still smell the metal in the rain, the kind that settles in your throat and stays there. The world above us roared with traffic, but down where we stood, everything felt strangely quiet. Grace tucked her cheek into my collarbone and sighed the way babies sigh when they trust you to make things right. I cupped her back and kept saying we were okay, even as my hands shook. The truth is, I had been saying it for months, first in our small apartment in Columbus, then in the guest room at my parents' house in Dayton. Somewhere between those two places, the ground gave out. I didn't see it happen until it was too late. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments. And if you've ever had to start from scratch for someone you love, hit that like and subscribe so more folks can find stories like this. I grew up in a brick ranch on a quiet street in Dayton, the kind where summer meant sprinklers and chalk on the driveway, and winter meant boots lined up by the door. My mother Diane taught me to return the casserole dish cleaned and to write thank you notes without being reminded. And my father Gerald believed in leaving a place better than you found it, even if it was just a folding chair at a church potluck. We weren't fancy, but we were steady used cars with reliable heaters, dinners that stretched with extra rice, birthdays in the backyard, with a single row of candles and the same off-key song every year. That's the world I knew how to navigate, a world where you earned trust by telling the truth and showing up. When I married Evan at 26, I thought we were building that same kind of life. Small but solid, humble but ours. He worked long shifts at a parts warehouse on the edge of Columbus, and I stitched together hours as a cashier until Grace was born, and nights turned into a loop of bottles, burp cloths, and whispered lullabies. The first months were a blur of exhaustion and tenderness, the kind that makes you cry in the laundry room and laugh 15 minutes later over a sink full of tiny socks. We watched every dollar rent first, then the light bill, then groceries, then everything else. I told myself the tiredness I saw in Evan's face was the same tiredness I carried in my shoulders, a price we were both paying for the little life sleeping between us. When his phone started lighting up after midnight, I chalked it up to a buddy on the overnight shift or a manager with no sense of time. I learned to look away when the screen flashed and to focus on Grace's steady breathing instead. I clung to what I understood: kindness in small doses, honesty without theatrics, the daily work of loving a child who needed you before she could even say your name. If something felt off, I smoothed it like a wrinkle in a sheet and kept moving. When bills rose and the cost of formula pinched, I reminded myself we were not the first young parents to feel stretched, and that decency and effort still counted for something. But there's a difference between a rough patch and a crack in the foundation, and once that difference shows itself, you can't unsee it. The contrast between what I came from, a house where flaws were patched and furniture lasted decades, and what I was standing in, a life where silence answered too many questions, grew louder than any highway. I tried to pull us back toward center. I made a list on the fridge, simple things like eat together and walk after dinner, the kinds of steps that used to mean we were okay. I filled the freezer with casseroles, the kind my mother taught me to bake low and slow so the edges stayed soft. I told myself the ache in my chest was only fatigue that would pass as Grace started sleeping longer. When the apartment felt tight, I pictured the front porch in Dayton and the way my father sat with a mug, letting the morning come to him without rushing. I thought if I could borrow that calm and set it on our kitchen table, the rest might settle. Instead, the air filled with unasked questions. Evan's smile thinned, his shift ran over more nights than not, and my reflection started to look like someone I'd seen once and couldn't place again. One evening, after a day that began with a pediatrician's visit and ended with a sink full of bottles, I laid Grace down and stood in the doorway long enough to watch her hands release into sleep. In the living room, the television hummed to an empty couch while I gathered socks, tossed them into a basket, and told myself I'd fold them in the morning. Evan's phone buzzed on the armrest, a short, bright sound that didn't belong to either of us. I don't know why I picked it up. Maybe because my hands were already moving, maybe because the buzzing wouldn't stop. The screen lit the room in a cold square of white. A preview line hovered there, plain as the grocery list on our fridge, and every easy explanation I'd been holding on to went quiet, as if someone had switched off a lamp. When I turned the phone face up, the glow lit the room in a color that didn't belong to us. A message blinked on the screen, short, careless, intimate. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Don't let her suspect." The letters blurred as my pulse started pounding in my ears. I set the phone down and waited for him to walk through the door, still half hoping it would turn out to be some misunderstanding. When Evan came in dripping from the rain, he froze. His eyes dropped to the phone, then back to me, and something inside him seemed to give up. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice flat and quiet. "I don't love you the way I used to. I've met someone else." I remember the sound of Grace breathing from her crib, small, and even the only thing steady in the room. He kissed her forehead without looking at me, picked up the suitcase he'd already packed and left. The door shut, and the refrigerator hummed like it was mocking me for staying still too long. For a few seconds, I stood there listening to the silence between the walls, trying to feel the air move. Then I went to Grace, lifted her from the crib, and whispered that we'd be fine, even though the word fine felt hollow in my mouth. The days that followed blurred together. I went back to my cashier job at the grocery store, working double shifts whenever I could, but half my pay disappeared into rent before I even bought milk. I skipped dinner most nights pretending I wasn't hungry, so Grace could have formula. When the notices started showing up on our door, bright orange paper shouting pay or vacate, I folded them in half and pushed them under the couch like that could buy us time. I told myself I'd find a way that things couldn't possibly get worse. But they did. One night when Grace wouldn't stop crying and my stomach ached from coffee instead of food, I dialed my parents' number. My mother's voice came through after a long pause, calm but distant. "You can come home," she said, "but don't expect this to be permanent." It wasn't the welcome I needed, but it was a roof. I packed what we had left, 2 bags, a few onesies, and the soft blanket Grace loved, and took the bus to Dayton. The ride felt endless. Grace slept against my shoulder while the windows rattled and rain smeared the glass. I tried to imagine the house I grew up in, the way it used to smell like laundry soap and Sunday roast, but the image didn't hold. When we arrived, my mother opened the door without smiling. "Bring your things upstairs," she said. "Your old room's full of boxes. You'll need to clean it." My father sat in his recliner watching a game on the television and didn't look up. "Make sure the baby doesn't cry too much," he muttered. "I need my sleep." The room I'd once called mine was crowded with storage bins and dusty furniture. I cleared a corner big enough for a crib and laid Grace's blanket there, trying to believe it would feel like home again. Every night I whispered promises to her promises I wasn't sure I could keep, that someday we'd have a place of our own. I kept to the edges of the house, cooking, cleaning, staying quiet. My parents didn't ask questions about Evan, and I didn't offer answers. When my brother Jason came to visit with his wife Amanda and their 2 kids, my mother's voice softened in a way I hadn't heard since childhood. She laughed easily, praised Jason's new promotion, and set out her best dishes. Grace reached for her, once babbling, but my mother turned away to refill Jason's coffee. I saw my father lift one of Jason's boys onto his lap, and for a moment I envied how natural it looked. To earn my keep, I found a part-time job at a nearby diner. I left before sunrise returned after dark and handed my mother cash at the end of each week. "Don't think you're living here for free," she'd remind me, even when I gave her more than half my paycheck. I didn't argue. The work was hard, but honest, scrubbing counters, carrying trays, smiling through the ache in my feet. Grace learned to sit up during that time, to reach for her toys, to laugh in bursts that made the walls of that cold house feel less empty. One night after a double shift, I came home to find Grace flushed and warm. "She's got a fever," I said, panicking. My mother didn't look away from the television. "You need to learn responsibility," she replied. "We raised our kids already. She's yours." I stood there holding Grace, my chest tightening. I wanted to tell her that being a mother was all I did, that I hadn't stopped fighting for this little girl since the day she was born, but the words wouldn't come. I sat up all night with Grace sponging her forehead and singing softly, watching her eyes flutter closed at dawn. The tension grew heavier with each passing week. My mother complained about Grace's crying. My father grumbled about the noise and the cost of groceries. "Look at your brother," my mother said one evening. "Jason has a career, a home, a real family. Why can't you be more like him?" I said. Nothing cutting my chicken into small pieces I couldn't finish. Grace's laughter carried from the next room light and oblivious, and somehow that sound kept me from breaking. Still, I tried to stay useful. I scrubbed the floors until my knees hurt folded laundry before they paid every cent I could. Nothing made a difference. They barely spoke to me except to point out what I hadn't done. When Jason and Amanda visited the house filled with warmth again, fresh sheets on their bed, dinner on the stove, my mother humming as she cooked. For us, there was only silence. One evening, while I was heating a bottle for Grace, I heard my parents talking in the living room. "We can't keep this up," my father said. "Jason and Amanda need the extra room when they visit." My mother sighed. "It's not fair to them. She's an adult now. She should be standing on her own." I froze the bottle slipping from my hand and rolling across the floor. 2 weeks, my father added. "After that, she's gone." I didn't move until they stopped talking. Then I went upstairs, shut the door, and sat on the edge of the bed. Grace slept peacefully, unaware of the deadline that had just been set over us. I pressed my face into her blanket and tried to think. 2 weeks. No savings, no backup plan, no one to call. The next morning, my mother acted like nothing had happened. She made coffee, flipped through the newspaper, and asked me to take out the trash. Every casual word felt sharper now. I wanted to ask if she remembered what it was like to hold her child and pray for safety, but I stayed quiet. I'd learned that asking for sympathy only made things worse. The days passed quickly, too quickly. I searched for apartments, but every place I found cost more than I earned. My tips from the diner weren't enough for a deposit. I looked into childcare options hoping I could work more hours, but they wanted money up front too. When I realized I was out of options, I started packing early Grace's clothes. Her stuffed bunny, a stack of diapers I'd been saving. My parents didn't offer to help or even ask where I'd go. On our last morning there, my father didn't come to the door. My mother stood with her arms crossed, her face unreadable. "Good luck, Marissa," she said as if I were a stranger moving out of a boarding house. I thanked her anyway. Then I walked down the porch steps with Grace on my hip, the air cool and damp, the sky a flat gray. At the end of the driveway, I turned once more toward the house, the place where I'd once believed love would wait if everything else failed. The curtains were drawn. Behind one of those windows, my mother was probably already making lunch for Jason's next visit. I shifted Grace higher on my shoulder and whispered that we'd figure it out. I didn't know how yet, but I meant it. We started down the street, each step heavier than the last, unaware that what waited ahead would test every promise I'd ever made. The day we left my parents' house, the air felt colder than it should have. I carried Grace on one hip and 2 bags that held everything we owned. The street was quiet except for the crunch of gravel under my shoes. I didn't have a plan, only a hope that someone would rent us a small room, even if it was just for a little while. By the time the sun dipped behind the roofs, we reached a row of old buildings near the edge of town. A hand-painted sign on a leaning fence read, "Rooms for rent, cash only." The man who answered the door had thinning gray hair and yellowed teeth. He looked me over, then nodded toward a narrow staircase. "Cash up front. No noise, no trouble," he said. I gave him every dollar I had left from the diner, praying it would be enough. The room smelled faintly of mildew, the wallpaper peeling in uneven strips. The mattress sagged in the middle, and the single window rattled each time the wind blew. Still it locked. I laid Grace on her blanket, her cheeks flushed from the chill, and whispered that we were safe. That night I stayed awake, listening to the pipes creak, counting every sound that didn't belong to us. When morning came, I went to the diner, pretending everything was normal. Without my mother to watch Grace, I didn't know what else to do. I bundled her into her stroller, wrapped in 2 blankets, and pushed her along the cracked sidewalk. I kept her in the back of the diner during slow hours, hoping no one would notice. For a few days it worked. She slept through most of my shifts, and the regulars left spare change near her stroller. But then came a Friday night rush. The orders piled up, the bell above the kitchen window ringing nonstop, and Grace started crying. I dropped the tray I was holding and ran to her, trying to hush her before the noise drew attention. My manager stormed out from the kitchen, his face red. "This isn't a daycare, Marissa," he snapped. "You can't bring a baby here. I don't have anyone else," I said, holding Grace close. Please, I'll keep her quiet." He didn't hesitate. "You're done here. Pick up your check and go." His words landed like a door slamming. The customers stopped talking for a second, all of them watching me. I carried Grace out into the night air, the wind cutting through her blanket, and walked until the glow of the diner lights disappeared. The days that followed blurred into one another. I sold my phone first, then my wedding ring, trading each piece of my old life for formula diapers and bus fare. When the landlord knocked on the door 2 weeks later, I already knew what he was going to say. "You're behind on rent," he muttered. "Out by tomorrow." I begged him for another week, but his face didn't change. The next afternoon, our things were in the hallway. The rain started just as we stepped outside. I held Grace against my chest, tucking my jacket around her, and stood under the small awning of the building. The street was empty. I called my parents one last time, hoping something in my father's voice might soften. "Dad, please," I said. "Grace is sick. We don't have anywhere to go." There was a pause, then his voice came sharp and final. "Jason's kids are coming this weekend. We can't take you back. You'll figure it out." The line went dead. I stood there for a long time, staring at the phone until the screen went dark. Grace whimpered softly, her head pressed to my collarbone. I started walking, not sure where my feet were taking us. The rain soaked through my shoes, the streets gleaming under the streetlights. Through the windows of houses, I could see families sitting down to dinner, hands passing plates, someone laughing at something small. The sight felt both close and unreachable. By the time the rain turned to a steady downpour, my arms were trembling from holding Grace. I found shelter beneath a highway bridge, where a handful of people huddled near a barrel fire. The air smelled of smoke and wet concrete. A man with a torn jacket glanced up when he saw us. "You can sit here," he said quietly, handing me a worn tarp. "Keep her warm." His name was Joe, a mechanic who'd lost everything after an accident. Beside him sat a woman named Marissa, who shared half a packet of crackers with us. I thanked them, too tired to say much more. That night, the wind howled through the cracks above, and rainwater dripped onto the tarp. Grace shivered in my arms, her skin clammy against my neck. I rocked her gently, whispering that everything would be okay, even as the words caught in my throat. Maria leaned over and placed her thin hand on my shoulder. "She's beautiful," she said softly. "Don't give up." Her kindness nearly undid me. I closed my eyes and prayed, not with the certainty of someone who expected an answer, but with the desperation of a mother who had run out of options. "Please," I whispered into the darkness. "If anyone's listening, help us find a way out." The sound of trucks passing overhead drowned out my voice, and for a moment I wondered if the world even knew we were there. The storm grew worse as the night went on. Water pooled along the concrete, seeping through my shoes. Grace whimpered, then fell into a shallow sleep, her breath uneven. I pressed my cheek against her hair and tried to think of tomorrow, of anything beyond the next hour. Every once in a while, headlights flashed across the underpass, throwing our shadows long against the wall before disappearing again. Sometime near dawn, the sound of footsteps echoed against the pavement. At first I thought it was just another person looking for shelter, but the rhythm was steady, deliberate. A tall man appeared out of the rain holding a large black umbrella. His suit was dark, his shoes polished even in the mud. He looked completely out of place beneath that bridge. Joe sat up, squinting through the dim light, then nudged me gently. "He's looking for someone." The man walked closer, scanning the small group of people before stopping a few feet away. His voice carried easily over the rain. "Marissa," he said. "Marissa Cole." I froze. Hearing my name felt strange, like being pulled back into a life I'd already lost. I stood clutching Grace tighter. "Who are you?" I asked. He lowered the umbrella, revealing a lined face and silver hair slicked to his forehead. His blue eyes were steady, almost familiar. "My name is Harrison Whitfield," he said quietly. "I'm your grandfather." For a moment I couldn't move. "My grandfather is dead," I said, my voice unsteady. He shook his head. "That's what your father told you. But it isn't true. He shut me out years ago after taking what wasn't his." The words didn't make sense. My parents had never spoken about him, not once. "Why are you here now?" I asked. Because I found out what's happened to you, he said. You and the baby. I won't let you spend another night like this. He reached out a hand but didn't touch me. Come with me. Let me give you a home. I looked down at Grace. Her small fingers curled into my coat. The fire flickered nearby, casting shadows on the man's face. Something in his expression, regret maybe, made me believe he wasn't lying. Still, fear kept me frozen. If you're not who you say you are, I said, I won't forgive you. Not for her sake. You won't have to, he answered. You'll never regret trusting me. The wind shifted, carrying rain under the bridge. Joe nodded toward the road. You should go, he said softly. She needs warmth. I hesitated one last time, then gathered our things and followed the man into the rain. A sleek black car waited by the curb, its headlights cutting through the storm. A driver in a dark coat stepped out and opened the back door. Inside, I saw an infant car seat already installed, clean and waiting. I slid in, holding Grace close. The door shut, sealing us in a bubble of warmth and quiet. For the first time in months, I exhaled. Grace stirred her small face, relaxing against my chest. As the car pulled away, I watched the bridge fade behind us. The firelight flickered until it disappeared completely. I didn't know where we were going or what waited on the other side of that ride, but for the first time in a long while, I let myself believe there might still be a way forward. The ride through the storm felt unreal. The hum of the tires against wet pavement was steady, almost soothing, and the air inside the car carried the faint scent of leather and rain. Grace slept soundly in the car seat beside me. Her tiny hands relaxed, her chest rising in rhythm with the engine's quiet vibration. Across from me, Harrison sat with his umbrella folded neatly at his side. His expression calm but watchful, like he didn't want to frighten me by saying too much too soon. The headlights stretched ahead in long ribbons of light, and for the first time in months, I felt warmth seeping into my skin. We drove for hours, leaving the storm behind. When the car finally slowed, dawn was breaking. The sky had that soft gray-blue color that comes before sunrise, and as we turned down a private road lined with tall palms, I saw the outline of a large, cream-colored house ahead. Iron gates opened automatically, revealing a long driveway bordered by trimmed hedges and bright flowers that somehow looked untouched by the rain. The house came into view fully, then 2 stories high with wide windows and a red-tiled roof that glowed faintly in the new light. My breath caught. "This is your home?" I asked quietly. "Our home," Harrison replied. "You and Grace belong here now." When the car stopped, the driver stepped out and opened the door. A rush of warm air brushed against my face as we entered the foyer. The floor gleamed under a chandelier that threw soft light across the space, and the scent of fresh lilies filled the air. 2 people waited just inside, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a younger man in a white chef's coat. "This is Teresa," Harrison said. "She keeps the house running. And this is Marco, our chef." "Welcome, Teresa," said her voice, gentle but steady. "We've been preparing your rooms." I nodded, still holding Grace close. The woman's tone wasn't pitying, it was warm, careful, like she understood how fragile this moment was. She led us upstairs to a large bedroom painted in soft cream tones. Sunlight spilled across the floor through tall windows, catching on the edges of a wooden crib that stood beside the bed. Inside the crib were folded blankets, a tiny stuffed bear, and a soft quilt embroidered with flowers. I laid Grace down and covered her with the blanket. For a long moment, I just watched her sleep, the color returning to her cheeks. Behind me, Harrison said quietly, "You don't have to be afraid anymore. You're safe here." That morning, a doctor arrived at the house. He introduced himself as Dr. Alvarez, setting his medical bag on the dresser. He examined Grace first, listening to her heartbeat and checking her temperature. "She's a bit weak from the cold," he said, "but she'll recover quickly now that she's warm and fed." Then he turned to me. "You need rest, Miss Cole. Real rest." It wasn't until he said it out loud that I realized how long it had been since I'd slept more than a few hours at a time. When he left, Teresa brought a tray with warm broth and soft bread. I ate slowly, every bite grounding me back into something that felt real. Later, I lay beside Grace and drifted into the first deep sleep I'd had in months. The following days settled into a rhythm I hadn't known I needed. Each morning, I woke to sunlight instead of street noise. Teresa helped me with Grace's clothes, folding them neatly into drawers that smelled faintly of lavender. Marco cooked meals that made the entire house smell like home, fresh bread, roasted chicken fruit, cut into perfect slices. Harrison spent his mornings reading in the study or walking through the garden, but he never let a day pass without checking on us. One afternoon, he invited me to join him on the balcony. A soft breeze moved through the palms, and beyond the garden wall, the ocean shimmered in the distance. "Tell me about your life," he said quietly. "I want to understand what you've been through." I hesitated, unsure where to start, but something in his voice, steady patient, made it possible to speak. I told him about Evan, about my parents' coldness, about the bridge, and the strangers who had shown us kindness when no one else did. I spoke until my throat ached, and the tears I'd been holding back finally fell. Harrison didn't interrupt. When I finished, he reached across the table, his weathered hand resting gently over mine. "You've carried more than anyone should have to," he said. "But you won't carry it alone anymore." In the days that followed, I started to believe him. Grace began to laugh again, her tiny voice echoing through the halls. At night, I stood by her crib and watched her sleep without the fear that something might take her from me. For the first time in a long time, silence meant peace, not danger. One morning, as I helped Teresa fold linens, Harrison appeared in the doorway, holding a folder. "Marissa," he said, "I'd like to offer you something. A chance to work at my company, Whitfield Properties. You'd start from the beginning, of course, but I believe you'd do well there." I looked at him startled. "Me, I don't know anything about real estate." He smiled. "You know about perseverance, and people trust those who've lived through hard things. That kind of strength can't be taught." I didn't answer right away. The thought of stepping into a professional world after everything that had happened felt impossible. But that evening, as I rocked Grace to sleep, I thought about what he'd said. Maybe this was a way forward, not just survival, but a real future. The next day, I agreed to try. Harrison arranged for me to start as a trainee at the downtown office. Teresa helped me choose a simple navy suit, and Marco packed a small lunch for me that first morning. Harrison didn't accompany me inside. He wanted me to walk through those doors on my own. The office gleamed with glass and light. People moved quickly, their conversations clipped and professional. Harrison introduced me to the team only once, keeping his tone even. "Marissa is here to learn from the ground up," he said. "Treat her as you would anyone else." I could tell by the way the others nodded that his word carried weight. Those first weeks were hard. I stumbled through phone calls, confused by the language of contracts and listings. Sometimes my hands trembled when I dialed clients, and my voice caught when I tried to explain things I barely understood. But every evening I came home to Grace's laughter and Harrison's quiet encouragement. That was enough to make me go back the next day. A few months in, I met Nora Barnes, a senior agent, who took an interest in helping me. She was sharp but kind, with a sense of calm that steadied everyone around her. "Don't worry so much about the numbers," she told me. "Listen to what people want. You've got that gift already." She taught me how to read people's faces during open houses, how to notice the way someone lingered in a kitchen or paused at a window. Slowly, the job began to make sense. Clients started requesting me personally. They said I made them feel comfortable, that I actually listened. When I closed my first sale, a modest condo for a retired couple, I ducked into the restroom afterward and cried quietly, not from sadness, but from relief. By the time I returned home that evening, the sun had dipped below the palms, and the house was glowing with lamplight. Harrison was sitting on the porch with Grace on his lap, her small hands wrapped around his fingers. He looked up and smiled. "How did it go?" I handed him the file from the sale. "We did it," I said. He nodded, pride softening his features. "I never doubted you." That night, after Grace fell asleep, I stood by the window and looked out over the garden. The air smelled of orange blossoms, and the fountain's soft trickle echoed through the courtyard. I thought of where we'd been, the cold rain, the bridge, the strangers who had shared their fire. The distance between that world and this one felt impossible to measure. For the first time, I let myself imagine a future that didn't end in loss. The fear that had lived in my chest for so long began to loosen, replaced by something steadier, something that almost felt like hope. I didn't know what would come next, But as I watched the light flicker across the sleeping face of my daughter, I felt ready to find out. 6 months passed before I noticed how different the woman in the mirror had become. The shadows that once lived beneath my eyes had faded, replaced by quiet determination. Each morning, I slipped into that navy suit, tied my hair back, and walked through the glass doors of Whitfield Properties like I belonged there. I wasn't the frightened mother clutching her child under a bridge anymore. I was learning how to build something of my own piece by piece, one day at a time. Work came slowly at first. I fumbled through the early months, mixing up documents and losing my voice halfway through phone calls. Nora was patient. She'd lean against my desk, pointing out how to read a client's hesitation or when to pause before answering a tough question. "People don't just want houses," she'd say. "They want to feel safe. You know what that means, don't you?" I always nodded because she was right. Safety wasn't an idea to me, it was survival. I started spending my evenings studying files instead of watching television, learning terms that once felt like a foreign language. Appraisal, escrow, title insurance. They stopped being words I feared and became tools I could use. I stayed late most nights, walking the quiet hallways after everyone left, my heels clicking on the marble floors. Some nights, Harrison would still be in his office reading through reports. He never commented on the late hours, only looked up and gave a small nod that said he noticed. When I closed my first deal, a small condo for an elderly couple moving closer to their grandchildren, I signed the papers with shaking hands. The woman patted my arm and said, "You're different, dear. You actually listen." I held that compliment close, more precious than any paycheck. It felt like the first real proof that I could stand on my own again. Grace was 3 by then, bright and curious, always running through the halls of the house with her curls bouncing. Teresa adored her, teaching her to bake small cookies and fold napkins for dinner. Marco spoiled her endlessly, slipping her strawberries before meals. The sound of her laughter filled every corner, chasing away whatever remnants of loneliness had been left. Harrison watched her with a tenderness that softened even his most serious expressions. He'd sit with her in the evenings, reading picture books with voices that made her giggle uncontrollably. Sometimes I'd catch him watching us from across the room, a small content smile tugging at his mouth. Once when I thanked him for everything he said, "You've done the hard part, Marissa. You just needed someone to open the door." By the time Grace turned 4, I'd earned a permanent position. My title changed from trainee to associate, then to senior agent. Clients began asking for me by name, and soon I was mentoring new hires the way Nora had guided me. She liked to joke that I'd learned faster than anyone else in the building. "You don't wait for permission to rise," she told me one afternoon. "That's why people trust you." The company started expanding, opening new offices in nearby cities. Harrison invited me to attend leadership meetings, sitting beside executives who'd been with him for decades. He rarely spoke about family, but once during a late meeting he said quietly, "I built this from nothing, but I always meant for someone with my blood to carry it forward." When he said it, his eyes weren't cold like my father's had been. They were proud. Years passed, and what started as a lifeline turned into a life. Grace grew taller, started school, and filled the kitchen with her drawings and spelling tests. I worked longer hours but always made it home for dinner. The house had stopped feeling borrowed. It was ours. Then one morning Harrison called me into his study. The light through the tall windows touched the silver strands in his hair. "The board has been talking," he said, folding his hands. "They want new leadership, someone who understands both the business and the heart of what we do. They voted last night. The position is yours." For a moment I thought I'd misheard him. "Mine." He nodded. "You've earned it. This isn't a gift. It's the result of your own work." I didn't speak right away. All I could think about was the woman who had once begged her father for a place to stay, who had walked through the rain with a baby on her hip and no one to call. The distance between that night and this one felt infinite. When the official announcement came, the entire office clapped. Nora was the first to hug me. "Told you," she whispered. "You were built for this." I smiled, trying not to cry. The months that followed were a blur of new responsibilities, long meetings, travel interviews. Harrison slowly stepped back, trusting me to take the lead. News outlets picked up the story, from homeless single mother to CEO of Whitfield Properties. They wanted me to talk about it on camera, to tell the world how I'd climbed out of the dark. I sat under bright studio lights and spoke with steady calm. "Life may knock you down," I said, "but you decide when to stand back up." After the broadcast aired, messages poured in from strangers who said my story gave them hope. Harrison watched one of the interviews from his study and simply said, "You make us proud, but success has a way of drawing old shadows back into the light." One afternoon, Nora buzzed my office line. "Marissa," she said quietly, "there are 2 people in the lobby asking for you. They say they're your parents." The words hit like a door creaking open after years of silence. My hands paused above the keyboard. "My parents," I repeated. "They're here. They insisted on waiting." Nora replied, "Do you want me to ask them to leave?" I stood slowly smoothing my jacket. "No, I'll come down." The elevator ride felt endless. The lobby gleamed with glass and polished floors, so different from the places where my parents had left me to fend for myself. When the doors opened, I saw them sitting on the couch across from the front desk. My mother's hair had grayed at the edges, and my father's shoulders looked smaller than I remembered. They stood when they saw me. "Marissa," my mother began, her voice warm in a way it had never been before. "We saw you on TV. You've done so well. We're so proud." I stopped a few feet away, keeping my expression calm. "Proud." My father cleared his throat, forcing a smile. "We should reconnect. Family should stay close, especially after everything we've been through. Maybe we could help you manage things. Keep your success in the family." The words landed with a dull weight. Family. The same people who had locked the door behind me now spoke as if they'd never turned me away. I thought of Grace asleep in her bed that night, under the bridge of Harrison's steady hand, when he told me I was safe. Before I could answer, a familiar voice came from behind me. Marissa Harrison said, his tone even but firm. He approached, his presence commanding the entire space. My parents froze. My father's face drained of color. "Dad," he stammered, "you're alive." "Yes," Harrison said, his voice cool. "And I've been watching. I saw what you did to your daughter the same way you once betrayed me." The lobby fell silent. Employees had paused nearby, uncertain whether to move. Harrison didn't lower his voice. "You stole from me, Kenneth. You left your own child to suffer, because pride meant more to you than love." My father opened his mouth, then closed it again. My mother's eyes darted to the floor. I took a breath. "There's nothing left to explain," I said quietly. "The day you shut that door, I stopped being your responsibility. I built my own life, and my daughter will never know that kind of rejection." Harrison rested a hand on my shoulder, solid and reassuring. "She doesn't need your kind of family," he told them. The silence stretched until my father finally said, but the words failed. They left soon after the glass doors closing behind them with a soft hiss. For a long moment, I stood there, my pulse slowing, the tension in my chest easing. When I finally turned, Harrison's expression was calm. "You did well," he said quietly. "You faced them without fear." I nodded, though my throat felt tight. The echoes of their footsteps faded, replaced by the low hum of conversation resuming around us. The air in the lobby felt lighter somehow, as if a long-closed window had finally been opened. That night when I got home, Grace came running to me, waving a drawing she'd made at school. Harrison watched from the porch, smiling faintly. The sun dipped low over the garden, casting gold light across the fountain. For the first time, I realized I wasn't carrying the past anymore. It had finally let go. Still, as I tucked Grace into bed and kissed her forehead, I couldn't shake the sense that something larger had shifted. We weren't just surviving now. We were stepping into a future built on truth, not fear. I turned off the light, knowing tomorrow would bring something new, something I was finally ready to face. When the glass doors closed behind my parents that day, the sound echoed longer than I expected. For a moment I stood still, watching their reflections fade in the polished floor. The years I'd spent chasing approval, the nights I'd questioned my worth, all of it seemed to dissolve into quiet. Harrison's hand rested on my shoulder, steady and calm. "You did exactly what needed to be done," he said. I nodded, though words didn't come easily. For the first time, I wasn't trembling. The weight I'd carried for half my life was gone, leaving space I didn't yet know how to fill. That evening I drove home as the sun sank low over the bay. The air was warm, soft, with the scent of salt and magnolia. Grace met me at the door, her arms flung wide, a drawing in her hand. "Mommy, look, Grandpa helped me make a castle." She held it up proudly, crayon towers in bright colors, the word home written above in her wobbly handwriting. Harrison appeared behind her, smiling faintly. "We had an architect in the house today," he teased. I laughed, setting my bag down. The simple rhythm of that moment, Grace's laughter, the scent of dinner drifting from the kitchen, was everything I'd ever needed and didn't know how to ask for. We ate together at the long oak table, the same one that had once felt too large for just the three of us. Marco served roasted chicken and vegetables, humming as he poured water into our glasses. Harrison told stories about his early years in business, how he'd built Whitfield Properties from a single office, how the first house he sold was barely standing when he found it. Grace listened with wide eyes, interrupting every few minutes with questions. "Was Grandma there too?" she asked once. Harrison's smile softened. She was. She believed in me before anyone else did. The light in his eyes dimmed briefly, then brightened again when Grace started describing her school project. After dinner, we sat on the porch, while the sky turned from gold to deep blue. The fountain in the garden murmured quietly, and Grace chased fireflies across the grass. Harrison leaned back in his chair, his gaze following her. "You know," he said quietly, "there was a time I thought I'd lost all of this family connection purpose. But you and Grace, you've given me more years than I thought I had left. I didn't know how to respond, so I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. You gave us a chance when no one else would." I said. He shook his head. "You would have found your way eventually. I just got lucky enough to be part of it. The months that followed were full in a different way. Work demanded more of my time as we expanded into new markets, and I often found myself traveling between offices." Harrison, though older now, refused to slow down completely. He came to the office once a week, cane in hand, insisting on reviewing proposals and greeting new employees. "You can't lead from behind closed doors," he told me. His presence reminded everyone where the company's heart came from. Grace flourished at school, making friends easily. She started piano lessons, her small fingers tracing uncertain melodies that grew stronger each week. Teresa kept the household running smoothly, her steady presence a comfort I didn't realize I relied on, until one afternoon she said gently, "You've built something beautiful here, Marissa." It was true. The house that had once felt borrowed now felt alive with laughter, footsteps, and the faint echo of a second chance. But life, even when good, has a way of circling back to test what you've learned. One morning, while reviewing quarterly reports, Harrison called me into his office. He looked tired, the color drained from his face, but his voice was steady. "You'll need to take over more of my responsibilities sooner than we planned," he said. "The doctors want me to rest for a while." The words hit me with quiet force. "Is it serious?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "Just time catching up with me. Nothing you need to worry about." Still I worried. He was 78, and though his mind was sharp, his steps had slowed. I adjusted my schedule, taking more meetings from home so I could be there for him. In the evenings after Grace went to bed, I'd sit with him on the balcony listening to the crickets while he shared stories from his past. He spoke often about legacy, not money, but meaning. "What you leave behind isn't written in numbers," he said one night. "It's written in the lives you've touched." Those words stayed with me. At the next board meeting, I proposed a new initiative, a program to help single parents and first-time buyers find affordable homes. The room went quiet at first, then heads began to nod. "No one should raise a child without a roof they can call their own," I said. The motion passed unanimously. Harrison sat back in his chair, pride flickering in his eyes. "You've learned the right lessons," he told me afterward. The months ahead moved quickly. Whitfield Properties launched the new program, partnering with local charities to renovate older homes and sell them at cost. The first family we helped was a mother with 2 young boys, not unlike where Grace and I had once been. When we handed her the keys, she cried quietly, whispering, "I didn't think people like you existed." I understood exactly what she meant. At home, things felt peaceful. Harrison's health improved enough for him to join us for short walks in the garden. He and Grace planted a small lemon tree near the back gate, promising to make lemonade together once it bore fruit. On weekends, the three of us would sit under the patio awning, Grace drawing while Harrison read the newspaper. The house no longer felt like his and mine. It was ours, a shared world stitched together by second chances. One evening while watching the sunset over the bay, Harrison turned to me. "I want you to promise me something," he said. "Don't ever let what they did to you harden your heart. Strength doesn't mean closing the door, it means knowing when to open it." I promised, though my throat felt tight. He smiled, satisfied. "Good. Then I can rest easy." Not long after that, I found a letter in his handwriting on my desk at the office. It wasn't long, just a few lines written in careful script. "If you're reading this, it means the company is in the best possible hands. Lead it the way you've led your life, with integrity, with courage, and with compassion." I kept that letter in my drawer, unfolding it on days when the weight of responsibility felt heavy. By the end of that year, Grace's laughter had returned to fill the house again, though the air sometimes carried a quiet ache when Harrison napped longer than usual. Life had shifted, not in a dramatic way, but in the gentle rhythm of time moving forward. The business thrived, our outreach program expanded, and the community began to see Whitfield Properties not as a corporation, but as a place of trust. One night after a long day, I stood by Grace's bedroom door and watched her sleep. Her hair fanned across the pillow, her stuffed bear tucked under one arm. The house was still except for the faint hum of the ocean breeze through the open window. I thought of the bridge of the rain of the voice that had called my name through the darkness years ago. The journey from there to here seemed almost impossible to explain, but every step had led us to this moment. As I turned off the hallway light, I passed the framed photo on the wall, Harrison, Grace, and me standing in front of the office on the day we cut the ribbon for the new program. The plaque beneath it read, "Building Homes, Building Hope." I smiled, touching the frame lightly before heading downstairs. The night was calm, the air carrying the scent of the sea and jasmine from the garden. I stood by the window for a while, looking out at the city lights in the distance. Somewhere out there, the people who had once turned their backs on us were living their own lives, but their absence no longer felt like loss. It was simply space that had made room for everything good that came after. Tomorrow I would return to work, to Grace's school recital, to Harrison's morning coffee waiting on the porch. The world kept turning quietly and steadily, and for the first time in my life, I didn't need to chase peace. It was already here, resting in the warmth of the home we'd built together. The months that followed brought a kind of peace I hadn't known before. Work had settled into a steady rhythm, and the outreach program we launched continued to grow. Families who'd once been on the edge of losing everything now had front porches, small gardens, and keys that fit doors they could call their own. Every time we handed over a new set of keys, I saw a piece of my old life reflected in theirs. Each smile, each thank you, reminded me why we'd started it in the first place. Harrison's health stabilized through spring. He moved slower, leaning on his cane, but he never lost that spark in his eyes. He'd stop by the office some mornings, coffee in hand, joking that retirement didn't suit him. Grace loved those visits she'd wave from the receptionist's desk, calling him Grandpa Chief before running off to draw him a picture. The walls of his office were covered in her art, now bright crayon suns and stick figures beside framed contracts and news clippings. It was a blend of two legacies, the life he'd built before and the one we were shaping together. One evening I came home late from a meeting to find Harrison and Grace on the porch, watching the sun sink over the water. He was teaching her to whistle, though both of them were laughing too hard to manage a tune. I stood for a moment, just listening, the air thick with that soft, golden light that made everything feel still. When Grace spotted me, she ran over, her hair flying. "Mommy, Grandpa says, when the lemons grow, we'll make lemonade for everyone." I smiled, brushing her curls back. "That sounds perfect." Harrison's gaze met mine, full of quiet pride. Over dinner that night, he talked about expanding the foundation tied to our housing program. "We can reach farther," he said, "not just Florida. Maybe Atlanta, Charlotte, even Dallas." His excitement was contagious. "You'll need good people to run that," I said, half teasing. He smiled. "I already have them." By early summer, we held the first Whitfield Community Celebration, inviting every family we'd helped over the past year. The company courtyard buzzed with laughter, children chasing bubbles through the air tables lined with food from local vendors. Nora made a toast, her voice steady and full of warmth. Here's to the home that started it all, and to the woman who turned her second chance into 1,000 more. I felt my throat tighten as everyone raised their glasses. Harrison stood beside me, his hand resting lightly on my arm. "You've done well," he whispered. This is the kind of success that lasts." A few weeks later, I noticed he tired more easily. He brushed it off, saying he was just adjusting to the heat, but I could tell he was slowing down. Still, he refused to stay home when we scheduled a trip to visit one of our new community projects 2 counties over. The drive was long, and Grace fell asleep in the back seat, her head resting against my shoulder. Harrison watched her for a while before saying softly, "You know, Marissa, I used to think legacy meant leaving something behind, but I've learned it's about who walks beside you while you're still here." We arrived at a small ribbon-cutting event, an old neighborhood reborn through renovation. Harrison gave a short speech, his voice a little weaker than usual but steady. When he finished, the crowd applauded, and I saw tears in the eyes of several families standing near the front. On the drive home, he leaned back, eyes half closed, smiling faintly. "Your father couldn't destroy what was meant to endure," he said quietly. "You proved that." That night, as the house grew quiet, I checked on him before bed. He was in his study, the lamp casting a soft circle of light across his desk. "You should rest," I said from the doorway. He looked up and nodded. "In a minute." There was a letter beside his hand, folded neatly addressed to me. I thought nothing of it then. The next morning, Teresa found him in the same chair, his hands folded over that letter. He looked peaceful, as if he'd simply drifted off to sleep mid-thought. The house fell still when she called for me. The sound of my own footsteps down that hallway felt distant, unreal. I took his hand. It was cool, his expression calm, and something inside me broke quietly, without sound. The days that followed moved in slow motion. People filled the house, employees, friends, families he'd helped, each offering condolences that blurred together into the same gentle phrases. The funeral was simple, just as he would have wanted. Grace held my hand, clutching the small lemon blossom she'd picked from his tree. When it was time to speak, I stepped forward and looked out at the faces gathered beneath the white canopy. "Harrison Whitfield built more than homes," I said. "He built hope. He taught us that family isn't only blood, it's the people who stay, who show up, who believe when no one else does. And because of him, my daughter will grow up knowing that kindness can change everything." After the service, we returned to the house. The air felt heavy, but sunlight spilled through the windows like a quiet blessing. Grace climbed into my lap, whispering, "Is Grandpa with Grandma? Now?" I nodded. "Yes, sweetheart. And they're both proud of you." She smiled, resting her head against me. Outside, the lemon tree swayed gently in the wind. Weeks passed, and life found its rhythm again. The company continued to thrive, guided by the principles Harrison had lived by. We renamed our outreach foundation the Whitfield Legacy Fund, its first initiative dedicated to building homes for single parents. Nora oversaw much of the expansion, ensuring each project stayed true to its mission. On the day the first house opened under the new name, she handed me a plaque engraved with Harrison's words, "Strength isn't about closing the door, it's knowing when to open it." At home, evenings grew quieter. Sometimes after Grace went to bed, I'd sit on the porch with a cup of tea, listening to the night sounds, the rustle of the lemon tree, the soft hum of cicadas. The grief didn't disappear, but it became something gentler, a reminder instead of a wound. Teresa joined me one night, her voice low. "He would have been proud of how you've carried on." I nodded. "He still is," I said. By the end of summer, Grace's laughter had returned, filling the halls again. She'd run through the garden, pointing to the tree. "They're growing, Mommy," and they were small green lemons, forming along the branches, a promise quietly kept. When fall arrived, the company hosted its annual charity gala. It was the first one without Harrison, but his spirit filled every corner of the ballroom. Photographs of our projects lined the walls, and one image, a candid shot of him and Grace holding shovels at a groundbreaking, hung near the entrance. As I stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. "I once thought survival was enough," I began. "But Harrison showed me that thriving means lifting others with you. Tonight we celebrate not just success, but the compassion that built it." The applause rose slowly, steady and full. For a moment I felt as if he was there beside me, nodding in quiet approval. Afterward, as the crowd mingled and music filled the air, Grace found me. She climbed into my arms, resting her head on my shoulder. "Mommy," she whispered, "I think Grandpa's happy. I can feel it." I smiled through the ache in my chest. "I think you're right, sweetheart." Outside, the night was clear, the stars sharp against the dark sky. The city lights shimmered across the bay, and I could almost hear Harrison's voice again, calm, sure full of belief. We walked to the car together, Grace's small hand in mine. Behind us, the soft strains of laughter and music carried through the open doors, blending into the hum of life continuing forward. That evening marked more than the end of a chapter. It was the quiet turning of one life into another, the moment when grief began to fold itself into gratitude. Tomorrow there would be more families to help, more homes to build, more hearts to reach. And somewhere beyond the horizon, I knew he'd still be guiding us steady as ever, reminding me that love once rooted never truly leaves. After the gala, the house felt unusually quiet. The lights from downtown shimmered across the bay, and the hum of the city seemed far away, softened by the night air. Grace was asleep upstairs, her drawings from the event scattered across her desk, crayon portraits of me, Harrison, and the families we'd helped. I stood by the window for a long time, watching the reflection of our home ripple in the dark water below. For years I had measured safety by roofs and walls, but standing there I understood it had always been something deeper, something built from people who stayed when others walked away. The weeks that followed carried a calm rhythm. The foundation grew, the company thrived, and the lemon tree outside bloomed for the first time since Harrison planted it with Grace. Its branches bent under the weight of bright yellow fruit, the scent of citrus drifting through the open windows. One morning Grace tugged my sleeve, her hands sticky from picking the first lemon. "Can we make the lemonade now, Mommy?" Grandpa said. "It's time." We squeezed them together at the kitchen counter, the juice pooling in a glass bowl. I poured the first cup and set it beside Harrison's photo on the mantel. The smile in that picture, the quiet pride in his eyes, felt as alive as ever. Every evening, Grace and I sat on the porch as the sky turned to gold, just as we used to with him. Sometimes she'd talk about school or the friends she'd made. Sometimes she'd ask questions I didn't expect. "Do you think Grandpa can see us?" she asked once, looking up at the fading light. "I do," I told her. "He's the reason we're still standing." She nodded, satisfied, and leaned her head against my shoulder. The world felt smaller in those moments, but safe, like every hardship had folded into something worth keeping. At work, I began noticing small things I'd missed before, the way new employees smiled when they realized this company wasn't built on profit alone, the way families lingered after we handed over their keys, not out of obligation but gratitude. We had created something that reached beyond brick and mortar, a community bound by second chances. Nora once said, "You turned survival into generosity." I think she was right. It wasn't about wealth anymore, it was about worth. When autumn came, Grace's school invited me to speak at Career Day. I stood in front of a classroom full of curious faces, explaining what it meant to build homes for families who needed a place to begin again. Grace sat in the front row, her chin resting on her hands, her eyes bright with pride. When a little boy asked, "Why do you help people you don't know?" I paused for a moment before answering. "Because someone helped me when I had no one else," I said. And I promised myself I'd spend the rest of my life passing that forward. That night, I found the courage to open Harrison's letter again, the one he'd left on his desk that final night. The paper had grown soft at the edges from being unfolded so many times. "Keep going," he'd written. "Not for me, but for those who will need you next. And never forget, Marissa, you are the legacy." I folded it carefully and placed it back in the drawer, a reminder that love, when given freely, never really ends. Years ago, I'd believed justice meant revenge or repayment. But standing where I am now, I know it means something quieter. It means peace. It's the moment you stop waiting for an apology that will never come and choose to build something better instead. My parents never reached out again, and for the first time, that didn't hurt. Their silence no longer felt like rejection. It was simply distance, and I was finally standing on my own side of it. Grace grew up surrounded by warmth and truth. She never knew the coldness I once did, and that alone felt like a victory. Sometimes when she laughs, I hear echoes of the little girl who once shivered beneath a bridge, and I realize how far we've come. From those dark nights to this life of light and laughter, the path wasn't easy, but it was ours. Looking back, I don't see tragedy anymore. I see the faces of the people who reached out when I thought no one would. Harrison, Nora, Teresa, even the strangers who shared their fire that night under the bridge. They were proof that kindness is a form of rescue and that it can ripple through generations if you let it. Now, every time I drive past one of our new homes, I slow down just long enough to see the lights glowing through the windows. Somewhere inside, a family is sitting down to dinner, maybe laughing over something small, maybe just grateful for the roof above them. And I know that in some quiet way, Harrison is there too, woven into every foundation, every key, every beginning. So if you're listening tonight, wherever you are, I want you to remember this. No storm lasts forever, and no act of kindness is ever wasted. Sometimes life takes everything from you just to show you what you're capable of rebuilding. If this story meant something to you, take a moment to share it, or tell someone you care about that they matter. Because love, the kind that shows up when the world turns away, can change everything.